Morning, everyone. This is a topic that I've become particularly excited by, and I think it's because it's sort of broken the paradigm of what we have all lived with for so long, and that's having to go and spray our vines all the time to protect from disease. So just before we start, this is a lot of what I'm presenting today was put together by Mauro Nigri from Riversun. Mauro is based in Abruzzo in Italy, and I spent some time travelling around Italy with Mauro. He was fantastic. I'll skip through one of the slides because Daryl's presented it earlier. But I guess the topics that I'll be covering today, what are disease-resistant vines? It's a bit of a 101 session. What's happening in New Zealand? What's happening around the world with the breeding? Hopefully this will bring some excitement to you as it did with me. And there's a little video later on of me in the vineyards looking particularly excited. But it's really good to see them in the flesh, and hopefully the video will do that. So first of all, resistance to what? I guess the key pathogens that we're talking about are downy mildew and powdery mildew. They're obviously their history is they were endemic in the US and in the Americas, were transported across to Europe and infected Vitis vinifera, which had no genetic resistance, had no evolutionary resistance to these diseases. So immunity means that there's no risk of attack. Grapevines don't have any pure immunity, but they have tolerance, and so they can handle some attack, but obviously that tolerance varies between varieties and it varies between impact. But today we're talking about true resistance, which is the genetic traits. There's certain genes that provide true resistance, and they can be one or many against the same pest. On this slide here, you can see that there is genetic resistance here, but there is some impact, and that impact on the leaf tissues, the genes, I guess, fighting against the pathogens where the vines boost their defence mechanisms. So at present, these genes allow the rapid recognition of the disease, and they activate a sort of a mechanism of defence against the disease. So how do we gain this resistance? Well, we sort of saw this slide using Daryl's slide. We're playing up in the top right corner in that plant breeding, and we see it takes a considerable amount of time, 15, 20, 30 or more years of crossbreeding, bringing genes from a parent, a donor that has a very strong resistance, and then crossbreeding that over and over again with one of the sort of our typical varieties that we're trying to get the wine quality traits and viticultural traits in. So we're trying to make the new variety look as much like the traditional variety, but we're trying to include those genetic resistant genes through the breeding program. And obviously, the last two, the GMOs. Potentially the CRISPR technology, as Daryl alluded to, could hold some amazing potential in the future, but currently in New Zealand it's a GMO, and hopefully that may change in time. So I guess the history of, the goals of modern breeding are to make high quality vines, and ultimately for us in the wine industry, obviously high quality wines from those resistant varieties that have yields and flavours that are similar to the parent varieties that they're bred from. So there's 30 known resistant genes to both powdery and downy mildew, and the goal is to sort of stack 2 or 3 of those genes in the new disease-resistant variety. So you've got a sort of multi-layered defence. It's like the sort of the Swiss cheese analogy that we think about with health and safety, is if we've got multiple slices, there's less chance of the pathogen being able to affect that vine. But sometimes you don't want too many genes, because the genes can actually work against each other. We'll see a little bit later in the video where sometimes the vine's response to the pathogen is actually too strong, and that has a negative impact on the grape growth and therefore the potential of that variety. But the real aim of this is to get down to just requiring a couple of sprays, typically at flowering, but sometimes post-harvest. So that's I guess the end game. The history of breeding. Well, the first hybrid varieties appeared sort of naturally in the US when they imported European grapevines there for wine production in the sort of 16 and 1700s. Then there was a bit of amateur breeding and that sort of went on. And I guess then we had those American diseases travel over to the US. We had powdery mildew introduction, we had downy mildew introduction, then finally we had phylloxera. And I'm sure I don't need to repeat to you all the great wine blight in Europe. And obviously the breeding that then went on around rootstocks to manage phylloxera, and obviously the capacity to graft an American resistant rootstock with a European sign and the varieties that we grow today on top allowed the vines to deal with that. But as that breeding continued, there was a sort of boom of these sort of French-American hybrids. That's where that classic sort of foxy character that people sometimes think about hybrids came from some of those American vines. Then the Europeans themselves started to get much more interested after, I guess, the wine quality impacts of these French-American hybrids. I think there was over something like 1 million hectares of French-American hybrids grown in France up until the Second World War. But because the wine quality wasn't very good, they were removed. The Germans got into the breeding program and they're still quite deeply involved. And I guess the modern disease-resistant variety movement really started with the Germans. And then more recently, the Italians and the French have got quite involved, and that's what we're sort of more going to be focusing on, the varieties that are coming today. These are the modern varieties, have great wine quality attributes, and ultimately are meeting the ambitions of the European Commission, who are aiming to reduce pesticide use in vineyards in Europe by more than 50%. And how, as we all know, it's very hard to do so. We don't have any silver bullets. The spraying technology hasn't really changed, so genetics is really the answer to achieve that. And so that work continues today. So what does this mean in the vineyard? Well, we still have to apply some treatments, but there's really only two reasons that we're applying them. First of all is to reduce the chance of any sort of hyper-virulent pathogens that can get around the genetic resistance of the grapevines. And so to ensure, and also you want to, you've got things like botrytis in Europe, black rot and phomopsis is still problems, and we have insect pests that we still need to control. So they're not an absolute silver bullet, but they're getting over the vast majority of the spraying requirements by eliminating needs to spray for powdery mildew and downy mildew, basically outside of flowering. So 75% less spraying, and we'll see later on vineyards under high pressure where there's been no sprays, and it's quite remarkable to see. So what's happening around the world? France, I guess the big news out of France is that they've released a variety called Voltis in the Champagne AOC, one of the traditional AOCs of Europe, very strictly controlled with varieties. They've released Voltis, and it's being planted around townships. If any of you have visited Champagne, you'll know the vineyards are sort of out in the fields, and then there's little small towns, often with vineyards planted very closely around those towns. The idea is to be able to plant Voltis around all the houses so that they don't need to spray, or they have to spray very infrequently around the houses, which makes perfectly good sense from a public safety perspective. And apparently the wines that they're producing of that have great capacity to make very good base wines as well for sparkling. And I think the exciting thing about what's happening in France is they're really deeply involved in it now. They're looking at all the specific French varieties, and there's a whole lot of these second generational varieties that are coming down the pipeline over the next few years, which there seems to be quite a lot of excitement in from European growers. Italy has two institutes leading the program. Vivia Rochedo Cooperativi, which is involved with the University of Udine, and the University of Milan, which is working on a lot of rootstocks. There's quite a lot of action going on in vineyards in Italy, which is sort of why I went. About 2,500 hectares planted currently, but they sold 3 million DRVs in 2023. So that's, if you sort of think about how many hectares that's going to plant out, and you see that change coming forward, there's a big commercial movement into these varieties in Italy, which is fantastic to see. And there's a couple of exciting rootstocks coming down the M1, M2, M3 and M4. Some have some great potential for high quality red wines, and one of them has an amazing ability of drought resistance, which is really exciting. And then Germany, I guess, the home of the peewee movement, and I won't butcher the German language and try to, but it translates to disease-resistant vines. Fairly sizable area, a couple of thousand hectares planted, and continuing breeding. A lot of private breeding also in Germany. And then what's happening here? Well, on the back of my first trip to Italy, first thing I did when I got back, I think, was I rang Jeff Thorpe and said, Jeff, I reckon this will be right up your alley. So Riversun have gone out. They've, I guess, hopefully seen the potential that I saw, and they've gone out and signed commercial agreements with 6 of the breeders in Europe. And they're here. The great thing is we've got 5 disease-resistant varieties in quarantine in Auckland at the moment, and they'll be coming out in time. So Voltis that we talked about, we've got Sauvignon Ritos, which is one of the 2, I think, most promising Sauvignon-based varieties. There's another one called Sauvignon Nepis, which I think is even a higher wine quality potential and could have a significant impact in Marlborough in the future. And then a couple of other varieties in that mix. So Riversun has a team tasked with managing the program. And I think if we look at the timing of the program, so they've got vines in, they'll be released from quarantine next year. There's obviously a lot of time to bulk that material up for more virus testing. Not that far down the line. It's literally 2 years away from now. The first vines will be grafted and going into the ground. So really exciting. That'll allow some microvins and some testing in a local context. And then a year later, the first commercial grafting. And we think by about 4 years from now that we could see, commercial plantings of these new varieties, which is super exciting. And then probably 2030 will be the first time we get to taste any of these wines grown in New Zealand soil. So it is a long-term project, but it's, I guess like the rest of the world, everyone's moving in this direction. Our strict quarantine means that we have to get on with it. So Riversun are doing that. So there's a few photos here of my trip to Rochedo. This is the research centre in Italy. They're investing lots of money. They're growing thousands upon thousands of vines each year. These are crossbred from seeds. They plant them out in this situation to do genetic testing and to see their resistance. These aren't getting any spraying. They then take those individual vines from pots, they plant them out for a year, where again they sort of field test their disease resistance and conduct genetic testing. And then they multiply those out, as we'll see in the video. Then they go to a microvin stage, making more than 800 microvins from new varieties each year in this winery. And then they're really excited to open lots of bottles for you, and this, looking at a couple of Chardonnay resistant varieties here, there's huge potential in these varieties. So I've got a bit of a video here that hopefully shows you what I found on my visit. All right, so here we are in one of the vineyards of Luisa, and this is a Solari vineyard. So sort of see really nice sort of open bunches. There's a little bit of hail damage here, but this is a variety that's got both powdery and downy resistance. A few treatments this year, but about 1/3 of the normal vineyards. It's really clean apart from the bit of hail damage. So now going off to taste some wines. Here we are at VCR in their experimental vineyard, and these vines here, not sure of the parent variety. We think it's a Czech native variety, but this vine has had just 3 treatments for the year, one of which was for botrytis. So basically, 2 sprays, one for powdery, one for downy. If I was to show you a conventional vineyard here, there was no leaves left on it. The downy mildew pressure is so great. So really amazing. You can see infection has sort of started to take place in a few places, but the vine has killed it. And this other variety here, you can see that downy mildew has impacted it, but a lot of the leaves turn really brown and fall off because it has too strong a resistance to downy mildew. It's quite amazing. For all us Aussies, this is actually a resistant Syrah So again, this has just had 2 treatments this year for downy mildew, and the downy mildew pressure here is like off the charts crazy, but there's basically, look at that canopy. It's remarkable. These new varieties they're breeding here is just stunning. I'm amazed. So here we are in a plot, and each one of these vines, you can see down this row, is basically a single, comes from a single seed and a single selection. So there's quite a lot of variation. In this case, very small set. In the case of this vine, not much fruit. This vine here, you can see a lot of brown dying leaves because it's got a high level of resistance, but the leaves brown off once they fight against the disease, so probably not ideal. This variety here, tiny little berries, the size of those little puppies for Sauvignon. You keep coming along. This bunch here, despite a bit of hail damage, looks more like Sauvignon. And as we come up here, this is looking a little bit more classic Sauvignon-like. Flavour-wise, yeah, got a little bit of pyrazine, a little bit of classic sort of citrus. So this is the sort of first stage, and from here these vines then get multiplied out, taken out, grafted in, made into the micro vins, whereas these are micro vins done at a bottle level. And this is a red variety that seems quite prolific, and again, some vines just going through veraison. Have a look at how many bunches and how many the big open clusters on these bunches. But then we come to this vine at the end. Have a look at this bad boy. The size of that bunch must be, that's going to be like a kilo. And that poor vine is just trying to ripen literally all the fruit. But it hasn't got that much canopy. And this is a resistant Chardonnay. And again, that canopy for 2 treatments for the year. Only one for powder, or basically 2 treatments each for downy and powdery. So 1 copper, 1 sulfur, applied twice. A little later ripening. Bunch size is pretty classic. Looks good. These are the varieties that have high potential for us. Oh, is that a marmorated stink bug? Could well be. Won't be bringing that one back to New Zealand with me.
Good for make, I don't know, no alcohol wine.
So this is a Sauvignon Nepis vineyard here in Rochedo. This is, again, it's got to getting close to harvest. Really nice sort of citrus, quite a little bit of white nectarine flavour. No obvious methoxypyrazines again, despite its parentage. So, yeah, moderate yield. Bunch size is these are probably 120, 130 grams. So here's cropping around sort of 7 to 8 tonnes per hectare. So here we are with the other Sauvignon. This is Sauvignon Vitis. There's quite a bit more crop on this variety, as you can see. It's a little later ripening. There is a little bit of obvious methoxypyrazines there, but again, they're quite low. You've got, again, really nice citrus. Acidity is a little bit lower than Nepis, despite the fact it's not quite as ripe. But it's a really nice sort of lift in the mouth. Lots of that sort of white nectarine, lime, lemon flavour. So, huge potential. In the bunches. This is Pinot Force. So it's a little later ripening than some of the other varieties. With open clusters and very productive. All right, well, I'll skip my last section that goes on. Let's just say it was fascinating. But finally, just a quote. And I think this is a timely quote, just over 110 years since it was made. George Kudrek, you might recognise him as the guy who bred the rootstock, which we all plant today, 3309. And I think it really sums up this this whole point of disease-resistant varieties and genetics in grapevines. Drugs and remedies can only be only temporary palliatives. Phylloxera has been defeated by American vines and not by sulfites, and considering they used to almost poison the soils. Chlorosis is beaten by rootstocks in lime soils and not by iron applications. Mildew will be defeated sooner or later by hybrids that resist, and all the copper won't be enough after a few centuries. And obviously the Europeans are going through currently another significantly challenging springtime with downy mildew impacting regions from Bordeaux to Champagne and through Italy. So the timing for this with climate change couldn't be better. So thank you.